On December 2nd, 1804, within the Grand Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, an unprecedented coronation ceremony was taking place. The 35-year-old Napoleon grabbed the Imperial crown, symbolizing supreme power, from Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. But just 11 years earlier, at the Place de la Revolution not far from Notre Dame, King Louis XVI was beheaded in front of a furious crowd. After a brief silence, the crowd erupted in thunderous cheers. Almost everyone believed that the old world had been completely shattered, and a bright future awaited them. However, the drastic changes that occurred over the next 11 years shattered all their beautiful fantasies. The Girondins, the Jacobins, and the Thermidorians took turns at the stage. The reign of terror saw heads rolling and rivers of blood flowing through Paris. Political struggles tore the country apart, and everyone lived in fear. Not to mention the rampant inflation, food shortages, royalist uprisings, and the imminent threat of invasion by the coalition forces. At this critical moment of crisis, Napoleon emerged like a savior, turning the tide. A miraculous scene unfolded. The French, who had once beheaded a king, now crowned an emperor whose power surpassed that of any feudal monarch before him. Why did the French Revolution, which aimed to overthrow monarchy, ultimately create a new monarch? To understand this, we need to go back to the cold winter of 1788. In the winter of 1788, King Louis XVI stood anxiously at Versailles, gazing at the heavy snowfall outside. His family had ruled France for nearly 1,000 years, weathering numerous crises, but the current situation seemed incredibly complex. That spring, drought struck, followed by severe snowstorms in winter. Bread prices soared, and food expenses consumed up to 80% of the income of poor families. A large-scale famine was on the verge of breaking out. To provide relief, funds were needed, but the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence had saddled France with a colossal debt of 2 billion livres, equivalent to 5 years of France's total revenue. The government had no extra funds to address the disaster. Louis XVI's only solution was to raise taxes. To this end, he planned to convene the Estates General, which had been dormant for 175 years, to discuss national affairs. The Estates General was first created in 1302 by King Philip IV. The first estate consisted of clergy, the second of nobility, and the third of commoners. In the feudal era, with its low productivity, commoners struggled in hunger and ignorance. A small number of clergy, who monopolized religion and knowledge, along with military nobles, who controlled armor and horses, could dominate far more ordinary commoners. However, by the late 18th century, this pyramid-like feudal structure had become largely obsolete. The fundamental reason lies in the change of production modes. In 1765, the spinning jenny was invented, and in 1769, James Watt improved the steam engine. Humanity was standing at the threshold of the first industrial revolution. Factories sprang up everywhere, and ships set sail across the globe. This unstoppable force swept through Europe, completely altering the balance of power from the feudal era. The newly emerging bourgeoisie of the Third Estate had more wealth than the First and Second Estates combined, yet they still couldn't obtain political status to match their economic power. Thus, Enlightenment ideas opposing feudal monarchies became their most potent weapon. The American War of Independence across the ocean further showed them the possibility of completely overthrowing the feudal privileged classes and establishing a bourgeois government. The upper echelons of the Third Estate fought for power, while the lower strata fought for survival. The growth of industry and commerce inevitably led to agglomeration effects, causing an influx of population and resources into Paris. On one hand, this resulted in rural decline and a crisis in food production. On the other hand, it gave rise to a new social class, the urban poor. In Paris, they were disdainfully called the sans-culottes. Unlike peasants who at least owned land, they were truly propertyless. However, industry and commerce were highly susceptible to economic fluctuations, leading to mass unemployment. In such times, apart from government relief, they had no means of survival. Throughout the 18th century, France's population grew by 35%, reaching 28 million, leading to sharp social conflicts. The defeat in the 7 Years' War deprived France of the opportunity to relocate its surplus population to colonies. Consequently, almost no one in the Third Estate, which made up 95% of the population, was satisfied with the current system. All of this turned France into a massive powder keg, needing just one spark to ignite it. That spark was the hatred of noble privileges. Compared to other European countries, French nobility was relatively enlightened and progressive, with many supporting Enlightenment ideas. However, they had a fundamental difference from other European nobles. They had been stripped of their political power. Since the end of the Hundred Years' War, central authority in France had been continuously strengthening. By the time of Louis XIV, local administrative powers were largely taken over by centrally appointed governors. As compensation, nobles retained tax exemption privileges, turning them into a class of rentiers. It's essential to understand that rights and duties are always reciprocal. Common people, no longer receiving protection and support from the nobility as they had in the past, could not tolerate the nobles' unjust privileges. The nobles themselves, politically stripped of power by the central authority and economically overshadowed by the rising bourgeoisie, harbored great resentment, primarily directed at the king. This was the situation Louis XVI faced. It was unlike any crisis France had experienced in 1,000 years. However, Louis XVI clearly did not realize this. He still believed he could solve the problems by restoring traditional dialogue with his subjects, unaware that this decision would lead him to his doomed fate. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General was formally convened at the Palace of Versailles. Louis XVI announced his plan to raise taxes, but the deputies of the Third Estate responded by saying that they would only agree to new taxes if a constitution was drafted. Until the constitution was established, the Third Estate would not pay a single coin for the king's bills. Louis XVI originally thought that the First and Second Estates would support him, but to his surprise, they eventually sided with the Third Estate to collectively pressure him. On June 20th, the deputies of the Third Estate, along with some from the First and Second Estates, formed the National Assembly and took a solemn oath at an indoor tennis court at Versailles. They swore not to dissolve until they had drafted a constitution for the nation and ensured its implementation. Facing the collective defiance of all three estates, Louis XVI exhibited his most fatal flaw, indecisiveness. On one hand, he made concessions to the National Assembly, expressing his willingness to establish a constitutional monarchy. On the other hand, he secretly deployed 30,000 soldiers into Paris, intending to suppress any potential uprisings. This two-faced strategy naturally angered the National Assembly, and they demanded the king withdraw his troops. However, Louis XVI ignored their demands. Just then, a message reached Versailles. The Bastille had been stormed. While Louis XVI and the National Assembly were locked in a constitutional struggle, the grain reserves in Paris had been completely exhausted. Desperate and starving, the citizens of Paris launched a three-day uprising. To fight the king's troops, they needed weapons. First, they seized the Hôtel des Invalides and found 28,000 muskets and over 10 cannons, but no gunpowder. So, they turned to the Bastille. The Bastille, originally a fortress built during the Hundred Years' War, had been converted into a prison for political detainees. At that time, it was guarded by only 82 prison guards and 32 Swiss guards. On July 14th, the rebellious Parisians positioned cannons at the gates of the Bastille, and the garrison immediately surrendered with hardly any resistance. For centuries, this heavily fortified stronghold had symbolized the absolute power of the French monarchy, seemingly capable of silencing all dissent within its solid walls. But when the armed Parisians confronted it, a mere push caused it to collapse. Along with it crumbled Louis XVI's hopes of regaining control by force. With all three estates against him and Parisians fully armed, he was now truly alone. Consequently, he ordered the troops to withdraw from Paris and don tricolor cockades as a sign of support for the Constitution. In the following days, he conceded to nearly all the National Assembly's demands: the abolition of feudal privileges, the cancellation of royal pensions, the elimination of noble tax exemptions, the confiscation of church properties, the abolition of the tithe, and so on. On August 26th, the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted, formally establishing principles such as inherent human rights, liberty, equality, and the inviolability of private property. These principles were subsequently enshrined in the first page of every French constitution. Up to this point, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The National Assembly never intended to abolish Louis XVI. Their goal was always a British-style constitutional monarchy. But unfortunately, Louis XVI fled. In June 1791, Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette secretly fled from Paris, intending to seek refuge with her brother, Emperor Leopold II of Austria. However, they were intercepted by the National Guard in the border town of Varennes and escorted back to Paris. The news caused a sensation, as the French people felt betrayed by their king and called for his trial. 2 months later, under Leopold II's influence, Prussia and Austria issued a joint declaration demanding that the French government ensure the safety and status of Louis XVI and his family, or face military intervention. War broke out, and Prussian-Austrian forces, led by the Duke of Brunswick, invaded France. In September, they captured Verdun, just a stone's throw from Paris. In this moment of crisis, an incredible sense of unity emerged across France. Volunteers from all over the country converged on Paris to defend the fledgling republic. On September 20th, the French Revolutionary Army repelled the Prussian-Austrian forces in the Battle of Valmy, driving them out of French territory. This victory greatly boosted the morale of French citizens, convincing them of their ability to defeat any adversary. The next day, news of the victory reached Paris, and the French First Republic was officially proclaimed, closing the door on the possibility of a constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI's life also reached its end. On January 21st, 1793, in the bitter cold, Louis XVI walked to the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Awaiting him was the guillotine, which he had personally helped design and improve. Calmly ascending the scaffold, he addressed the crowd with his final words, "I am innocent. I forgive my enemies and hope that my blood will calm God's wrath." With the fall of the blade, this most controversial king in French history passed away at the age of 38. The king was dead, but a colossal question loomed over the newborn republic. How were they to build an entirely new society? Even scouring the classics left behind by Enlightenment thinkers provided no answers. Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, they were writers, philosophers, intellectuals, but none had ever governed a country. Their proposals struggled to address the real-world crises. For instance, the fiscal crisis. Solving it required raising taxes. But if raising taxes was the solution, then Louis XVI's execution was in vain, as it was the inability to levy taxes that led to his downfall. Raising taxes was a non-starter. Auctioning confiscated church and noble properties was an option, and indeed it was tried. However, processing such a large volume of assets took time, while the fiscal crisis waited for no one. Thus, the government had to issue bonds, backed by these properties, known as assignats. These paper notes replaced metal currency and became de facto money in France. However, the value of assignats fluctuated wildly as the value of the backing assets depreciated. By 1792, assignats had lost 38% of their value, and within 4 years, they were worth less than 50%. This hyperinflation led French farmers to let their wheat rot rather than accept assignats, exacerbating the food crisis. Another pressing issue was the collapse of the old administrative system. For a long time, local administration in France had been handled by governors and officials appointed by the central authority, with their power derived from the king. With the king gone, their legitimacy vanished as well. Some joined the royalist rebellions, openly defying the central government, while others, despite their loyalty to the republic, saw their administrative efficiency plummet, making even basic tax collection a problem. Lastly, and most critically, this so-called Third Estate was never a single unified group. It was internally divided into numerous complex interest groups. The Feuillants represented the financial bourgeoisie, the Girondins represented the commercial bourgeoisie, and the Jacobins represented the petty bourgeoisie and some urban poor. Their political demands were inherently incompatible. When the king was in power, they could unite for their common interests. But once this common enemy disappeared, their alliance fractured, and they turned against each other. These myriad real-world problems were overwhelming, and France had little time to address them, as the coalition forces were already at their doorstep. It was in this context that Robespierre ascended to the pinnacle of power in the Republic. Robespierre was born in Arras, France, into a family of lawyers. In 1778, he entered the University of Paris to study law, where he was exposed to Enlightenment ideas, particularly those of Rousseau. In 1789, as a representative of the Third Estate, he went to Paris and proposed a series of radical measures, including support for universal suffrage, opposition to the king's veto power, abolition of the death penalty, and opposition to press censorship. These radical proposals earned him great acclaim. Due to his personal integrity and incorruptibility, he was also known as the Incorruptible. In 1792, after the establishment of the First Republic, Robespierre, as the top vote-getter among the Paris representatives, entered the National Convention and delivered the famous speech declaring, "The nation must live, the king must die." In 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Alarmed by the French Revolution, European countries formed the First Coalition, and 60 out of France's 83 departments saw royalist uprisings. At this time, the Girondins, who were in power, insisted on maintaining a free market, but they failed to control the soaring prices, sparking a citizens' uprising in Paris. Amidst this internal and external turmoil, Robespierre led the Jacobins to seize power. His first priority was to address the food crisis and rampant inflation. To this end, he introduced stringent wartime economic policies, including closing the stock exchange, abolishing joint stock companies, imposing price controls on food and essential goods, and cracking down on profiteering. These measures temporarily stabilized the value of assignats and restored the supply of goods in Paris. On the military front, to counter the invasion by the coalition forces, he issued Europe's first formal conscription order, declaring that from now until all enemies were driven from the Republic's territory, the entire nation would remain mobilized. All young men were to fight on the front lines, while those with families manufactured weapons and transported supplies, women sewed uniforms and tended to the wounded, children made bandages, and the elderly were to rally the troops in public squares. This total war mobilization quickly assembled an army of 420,000, dramatically reversing the military situation. By the end of the year, the French Revolutionary Army had twice defeated the Austrians and recaptured Toulon from the British. The following year, the French achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Fleurus, driving all foreign interventionist forces from French soil and quelling royalist uprisings across the country. However, behind each of these policies was enormous resistance, and Robespierre's method of implementing them was through a reign of terror. On July 13, 1793, the Jacobin leader Marat was assassinated by a Girondin sympathizer. Using this as a pretext, Robespierre reorganized the Revolutionary Tribunal, empowering it to arrest anyone who might threaten the Republic's safety. These individuals had no chance to defend themselves. Stepping into the tribunal was tantamount to stepping onto the guillotine. During the Reign of Terror, 50,000 people were sent to the guillotine, including many prominent scholars, social figures, and high-ranking officers. This inflicted nearly irreparable damage on France. One direct consequence was the purging of French naval officers, laying the groundwork for the Navy's future downfall. On April 5, 1794, Robespierre sent his ally, the Jacobin elder Danton, to the guillotine. Before his execution, Danton sneered at Robespierre, saying, "You're next." 3 months later, Danton's words came true. On July 26th, Robespierre gave a speech in the National Convention, declaring the need to completely eradicate the enemies of the Republic. He proceeded to accuse nearly everyone present. The uneasy deputies demanded he name the enemies, but Robespierre refused. On July 27th, when he returned to the convention, he was met with an arrest warrant passed unanimously. On July 28th, Robespierre was taken to the Place de la Révolution, where he met the same fate as Louis XVI, executed in the same place and manner at the age of 36. The nightmare of Robespierre was over, but the nightmare for France continued. After the fall of the Jacobins, the price controls were lifted and assignats plummeted to 3% of their face value. We all know what that means. Paris once again erupted in riots, the coalition renewed its attacks, and royalist rebellions flared up once more. France was in desperate need of a new leader to save the day. At this moment, our story's protagonist, Napoleon, made his grand entrance. Born on the island of Corsica in southern France, Napoleon entered the military school of Brienne at the age of 10, where he showcased an extraordinary talent for mathematics and geometry. In 1784, he graduated with top honors from Brienne and was selected to attend the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, specializing in artillery. During this time, a significant advancement in artillery technology occurred in Europe. In 1774, French artillery officer Jean-Baptiste Vaquet de Gribeauval improved cannon manufacturing by casting cannons as solid pieces and then boring out the barrel. This technique provided exceptional strength, allowing for greater range with less gunpowder. This heralded the era of more powerful siege artillery and highly mobile field artillery. A young Napoleon understood the profound implications of this shift. In 1785, at the age of 16, Napoleon graduated early due to his father's death and joined the La Fère artillery regiment as a second lieutenant. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out. Influenced by Enlightenment ideas, Napoleon was thrilled. However, when he witnessed the revolutionaries kill Louis XVI's guards without resistance, he expressed his disdain. In a letter, he wrote, "If Louis XVI had mounted his horse, victory would have been his." In 1793, France was in a dire crisis. The Jacobins came to power and Robespierre issued a general mobilization order. It was also when Napoleon got his first big break, the Siege of Toulon. Toulon was the most important military port in southern France, housing 30 warships and vast supplies of ammunition. In August, Royalist rebels, backed by the British Navy, seized Toulon, effectively cutting off France's southern coast. The French army had to recapture Toulon before enemy reinforcements arrived, or the consequences would be disastrous. In early September 1793, French commander Carteaux led 8,000 troops towards Toulon. However, Carteaux, a former painter, though politically reliable, had little knowledge of military tactics. During the fighting, his artillery deputy was wounded, necessitating the appointment of a new artillery commander, Napoleon. Napoleon proposed to Carteaux that Toulon's fortifications were too strong for a frontal assault and would result in heavy losses. The rebels were confident mainly because they had the British fleet's support. If they could take the promontory southwest of Toulon, the ships in the harbor would be within cannon range, forcing the British Navy to withdraw and the rebels to surrender without a fight. Napoleon's plan was perfect, but first, he had to capture the fort at the promontory, heavily guarded by the British. To break through, Napoleon braved enemy fire to position the artillery within 300 meters of the fort. When the battle began, he led the charge. His horse was killed by British cannon fire, and he sustained 2 injuries, one of which almost resulted in his leg being amputated. Inspired by his bravery, the French troops captured the promontory, forcing the British to retreat and recapturing Toulon. During this battle, Napoleon also met a new comrade, Massena, who would later become known as the Darling of Victory. They would reunite in the Italian campaign. Napoleon's success at Toulon earned him Robespierre's favor, and at 24, he was promoted to brigadier general. However, the good times didn't last long, for years later, Robespierre was sent to the guillotine. Napoleon was arrested, nearly sentenced to death, but was eventually released without charges, though his career seemed ruined as he was stripped of his rank. Until 1795, when Napoleon met the most important benefactor in his life, Paul Barras. That year, the new government was powerless to control inflation, and assignats had become worthless paper. Paris once again erupted in rebellion. At that time, Barras was in charge of the city's defenses and called upon Napoleon to help quell the uprising. When asked for a solution, Barras already knew the answer. But at that time, using force to suppress the rebelling citizens was almost career suicide, as the former hero of the Republic, Lafayette, had fallen for the same reason. Barras was unwilling to bear this responsibility, but Napoleon agreed without hesitation. Napoleon deployed his trusted lieutenant, Murat, who brought 40 cannons loaded with grapeshot and ended the battle in under an hour. The direct result of this uprising was the rise of the Directory government, with Barras as one of the first 5 directors. Napoleon earned Barras's favor through his decisive action and was promoted to Major General. In 1796, Napoleon was dispatched to Italy as the commander of the Army of Italy. At that time, the main French forces were engaged along the Rhine with the British, Austrian, and Prussian coalitions, and the situation was critical. To support the main forces on the northern front, Napoleon needed to make significant gains on the southern front, tying down as many enemy troops as possible. This task was daunting because the army was poorly equipped, lacking supplies and weapons. Many French soldiers went into battle armed only with sticks. Young Napoleon, with his relatively modest rank, was initially met with disdain by the senior officers, who derisively called him Barras's little protege. But Napoleon remained unfazed. His first action upon taking command was to assemble his command staff. It was then that a legendary chief of staff, Berthier, joined his ranks. Berthier, a former surveyor, had an incredible memory. It was said that once he looked at a map, he could recall any point on it with precision. He never missed a chance to gather intelligence and always provided valuable information for Napoleon's reference. Napoleon's mind was highly imaginative and unconventional, and only Berthier could adeptly interpret his visionary strategies. On April 5, 1796, the French army crossed the Alps and officially began their Italian campaign. At that time, the Austro-Sardinian coalition had 80,000 well-equipped troops, while Napoleon's forces numbered only 40,000. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon had an unmatched advantage in his understanding of mobility. From previous wars, he had already discovered that French soldiers had greater endurance than those of the coalition because they were younger and more aware of what they were fighting for. They could endure long marches day and night. Most of the officers in the Republic's army came from humble backgrounds. They ate, lived, and endured hardships alongside their soldiers, something many aristocratic officers couldn't do. This significant difference between the new and old armies should have been a huge advantage for the French, but previous commanders clung to outdated tactics, failing to leverage this strength. But Napoleon and Berthier were not ones to stick with convention. Before the campaign, Berthier had meticulously studied all the terrain in northern Italy and created detailed maps, ensuring each commander had a copy. When it came to route selection, he often chose unexpected paths, avoiding heavily guarded main roads and planning many surprising detours. But what about the supply lines? Napoleon dismissed the concern. He broke down the large field army into smaller, independent divisions, significantly reducing the logistical burden on each unit. Each division carried 10 days' worth of supplies, relied on captured weapons and ammunition, and sourced food locally. Under this strategic guidance, the bastions that had troubled European armies for 300 years became mere decorations. It was from this period that offense began to overshadow defense, and limited war gave way to total war. A new era of warfare was about to begin. On April 10, 1796, the French vanguard encountered Austrian forces at Montenot. 2 days later, Massena's division swiftly flanked the Austrians, forcing them to retreat and eliminating 3,000 troops in the pursuit. This scene would replay repeatedly. The Austro-Sardinian coalition couldn't keep up with the French army's encirclement speed, and their meticulously constructed defenses were completely disregarded by Napoleon. After losing another 6,000 men, the coalition withdrew northward. At this point, the coalition split. The Austrian forces wanted to withdraw to their major city, Milan, while the Sardinians aimed to protect their capital, Turin. This division gave the French the chance to defeat them separately. Napoleon decided to target the weaker Sardinian kingdom first. On April 21st, in the Battle of Mondovi, the French decisively defeated the 50,000-strong Sardinian army with 36,000 troops, forcing them to cede territory and pay reparations, effectively removing them from the war. Following this, Napoleon continued to advance towards Milan. During the Battle of Lodi, the French faced Austrian troops guarding a bridge with heavy artillery. The French soldiers, driven by sheer determination, stormed the bridge and broke through the Austrian line. Napoleon later recalled that it was during this battle that he felt his own influence and began to consider using it for greater endeavors. 5 days after the Battle of Lodi, Milan surrendered, and the wealthiest city in Italy fell into French hands. Napoleon then marched south, reaching the Vatican. Everywhere he went, nobles and clergy donated generously to his cause. Even Pope Pius VI had to make a substantial contribution to the French. This enormous sum of money not only allowed Napoleon to fulfill his promises of glory and wealth to his soldiers, but also rescued the Directory from a dire financial crisis. On June 4, 1796, the French army surrounded the Austrian stronghold of Mantua in northern Italy. Using the strategy of besieging and then intercepting relief forces, Napoleon eliminated tens of thousands of Austrian troops. For months later, the French marched unchallenged towards Vienna, receiving Austria's surrender at Leoben, just 100 kilometers from Vienna. At that time, the French northern front along the Rhine was on the brink of collapse, but no one expected Napoleon to achieve such a miracle with his underestimated forces on the southern front. In 1 year, he annihilated over 100,000 Austrian troops, conquered all of northern Italy, rescued France's fragile finances, and crushed the first coalition's invasion. Any one of these achievements would have made someone famous, but all of these happened to 28-year-old Napoleon, making him a household hero in France. On December 5, 1797, Napoleon returned to Paris. By this time, European countries had already signed treaties with France, but under the leadership of William Pitt the Younger, Britain continued to wage war against France. Thus, Napoleon requested permission from the Directory to lead an expedition to Egypt, intending to open a route to India and force Britain to negotiate. This audacious idea had little feasibility since Britain firmly controlled the Mediterranean and Indian Oceans. However, the Directory agreed almost without hesitation because Napoleon's growing influence threatened their power. They would have sent him to the moon if they could. On May 19, 1798, Napoleon set sail from Toulon with 30,000 French soldiers. By this time, he was the most renowned general in the French military, attracting countless elite soldiers and officers who would rather accept a demotion than miss the chance to serve under him. In addition to his loyal subordinates Berthier and Murat, two new commanders joined his expedition, the future Flower of Marengo, de Saix, and the Iron Marshal, Davout. On July 2nd, the French army arrived in Alexandria and then marched towards Cairo. On July 20th, they encountered the Mamluk cavalry beneath the pyramids. Napoleon famously rallied his troops with the words, "Soldiers, 4,000 years of history are watching you." The French were invigorated, and their cheers echoed loudly. As for the battle itself, there isn't much to say. The Mamluk cavalry, still fighting with outdated weapons, stood no chance against the French infantry's square formations, cavalry's powerful charges, and artillery's concentrated fire. After leaving thousands of dead, the Mamluks fled the battlefield. 5 days later, Napoleon's troops entered Cairo. However, the expedition ended there because to the north, British naval commander Nelson annihilated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon's army was now completely isolated. Unlike Italy, Egypt lacked sufficient arms factories to produce the necessary military equipment. Every shot fired meant one less in their arsenal. In their most desperate moments, artillerymen risked their lives to retrieve spent cannonballs for reuse. Despite these dire conditions, the French army marched through Egypt and into Syria. In May 1799, the French army faced fierce resistance from Ottoman forces and British gunboats at Acre, suffering 5,000 casualties and a severe blow to their strength, rendering them unable to launch any further large-scale campaigns. At this moment, the British thoughtfully delivered a newspaper to Napoleon, announcing the formation of the Second Coalition. This time, William Pitt the Younger had found a heavyweight ally for Britain, Tsarist Russia. Under the command of the 69-year-old General Suvorov, Russian troops swept through Italy, driving the French completely out of the northern side of the Alps. Now, the coalition's armies were closing in on French territory. Finally, Napoleon made a decision. In October, he secretly set off to return to France. The abandoned French expeditionary force held out in desperation for 2 whole years until they ran out of ammunition and supplies and were forced to surrender. On October 9, 1799, Napoleon returned to Paris, receiving a warm welcome from the citizens. Everyone hoped he could once again save France from its troubles. On November 9th, with the support of the military, Napoleon declared the abolition of the Directory and took over all administrative affairs of the Republic, an event known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The next day, Murat led troops to take control of the legislature and dissolved it. Shortly thereafter, France announced a new constitution, granting Napoleon the position of First Consul, allowing him to enact laws and appoint ministers, ambassadors, and high-ranking officers at will. He then abolished local autonomy, making France a highly centralized state once again. In reality, Napoleon had acquired absolute power far surpassing that of any feudal monarch in history. 5 years later, his coronation at Notre Dame de Paris was more a belated recognition of his de facto rule. The coup of 18 Brumaire is regarded by French scholars as the end of the French Revolution. This outcome was unimaginable when the revolution began in 1789. So, why did the French Revolution culminate in Napoleon crowning himself emperor? First, there's a fundamental question. If Louis XVI had not fled, would France have followed the same path as Britain's glorious revolution? I believe this was unlikely. The context of France and Britain were entirely different. France lacked Britain's insular geography, which meant the British bourgeois revolution faced little external interference. In contrast, France, at the heart of the European continent and surrounded by strong enemies, had any weakness immediately exploited by its rivals. Looking at the key turning points of the French Revolution, you can see this clearly. The death of Louis XVI began with the invasion of the Prussian and Austrian armies. The rise of the Jacobins started with the first coalition invasion, and Napoleon's ascent followed the second coalition invasion. External threats were a direct cause of the profound changes during the French Revolution. So, what about internal factors? When we look at British history, we can't overlook the Magna Carta of 1215. In reality, from the 13th century onwards, Parliament had already become a significant force in British politics. The House of Lords and the House of Commons, along with the monarchy, formed a balance of power through 300 years of continuous struggle. The constitutional monarchy we see was the result of this balance of power, not its cause. Fantasizing that a single constitution could resolve the complex political demands of different classes is naive. It's important to remember that Britain also went through brutal civil wars, beheaded a king, and had Cromwell's rule. It was not a bloodless revolution from the start. In contrast, France's absolute monarchy appeared to suppress class conflicts, but in reality, these conflicts were deepening. Each class saw conflict resolution as the king's responsibility, focusing on extracting more benefits for themselves. Once the king's mediating power was removed, the underlying conflicts erupted in the most brutal ways. As long as there was no consensus on the distribution of benefits, the French Revolution was inevitable, regardless of Louis XVI's choices. Why did the French Revolution spiral out of control? A significant reason was the weakness of the bourgeoisie at that time. They couldn't rebuild a new system after dismantling the old one. Administrative, tax, judicial, diplomatic, financial, and military systems all needed reconstruction. The emerging bourgeoisie lacked the power and experience for this task, struggling through trial and error. Their enemies, however, wouldn't give them the chance for trial and error, resulting in simultaneous internal and external crises, plunging the country into anarchistic chaos. As French thinker Tocqueville noted, the revolution eventually turned back to the old regime for answers. And what were those answers? They were Robespierre and Napoleon. The French Revolution destroyed the old feudal relationships and social structures. This left every ordinary citizen facing the state in isolation, with no intermediary forces to balance the two, creating fertile ground for authoritarianism. Concurrently, the internal crisis in France and the external threat of the coalition needed an authoritarian government to reconcile conflicts, implement reforms, and expel invaders. Robespierre, a political novice, lacked the political capital to subdue opponents, so he resorted to a reign of terror to physically eliminate dissent. But terror did not eliminate opposition, it magnified it. The scale of terror expanded, ultimately reaching everyone. When everyone was against Robespierre, the terror turned on him. As long as France's external crisis remained unresolved and its social structure unchanged, authoritarianism was bound to return. And so, we saw Napoleon return to his loyal Paris with dazzling victories, triumphant troops, and abundant spoils. He possessed political capital that Robespierre lacked, military power that even Louis XIV could not have imagined, a system of total war mobilization, a highly motivated revolutionary army, superior military tactics, and a group of contemporary generals willing to lay down their lives for him. All of this signaled that revolutionary France was about to export its revolution, the very prospect that terrified Europe's feudal monarchs the most. A great storm was about to sweep across Europe. From Marengo to Trafalgar, from Ulm to Austerlitz, from Vienna to Moscow, from Leipzig to Waterloo, he would witness the most glorious victories and the most brutal slaughter. He would see countless heroes rise and sacrifice themselves in the most magnificent ways. He mercilessly dismantled the old feudal order, promising a terrestrial paradise to every believer in the revolution. This storm was the Napoleonic Wars, and that is the story for our next episode.